That was deliberately the step, the move to put the radical nationalist circles at the top, provoke Russian reaction in Crimea and elsewhere, and to divide, to cut Ukraine from Russia, including eastern part that originally, in the beginning, were almost absolutely in favor of Russia, but under propaganda, under demonization, under Western suggestions that turned into the bloody mess. So this anti-Russian ideology has won over Ukrainian society, and they started to hate their own history, their own religion, thinking that the West is paradise and Russia is hell. And they were Russians that would like to escape so-called Russian hell that never existed, but that was.
Well, why is that a threat to Russia if that happens in this other sovereign state of Ukraine? Why is it a threat to Russia?
So,
because you're talking here about internal Ukrainian politics.
But that is not so, because first of all, what is sovereign? If you are great power, only the other great powers are sovereign, in your opinion. All the rest is a hypocrisy.
Yeah, so that is Glenn Greenwald, who I don't think I'm breaking new ground and saying I have mixed feelings about, having a conversation with, honestly, I don't want to say is one of the worst people in the world. They're war criminals, child rapists, right? But, within the subdivision of like philosophers, relative to that category, got to be one of the worst people. Alexander Dugin. The main event tonight is going to be me talking to Deep State Kuba.
I wonder.
The cat has struck.
Yeah, I wonder what happened. There's a lot of evidence. I don't think.
Yeah, the cat is truly the Alexander Dugin of the podcast.
Yeah, not happy. Not. Not happy. Not very pro Greenwald, right? Angry. Your cat is angry.
which is funny because I've always known Glenn to be more of a dog person.
Yes, very much so.
Lucy would have done that, right?
Maybe the most documented dog person on the planet, right?
Yeah, exactly. Right. He's got like 20 dogs.
I'm cool with that. Not mixed on that. I mean, I wouldn't personally.
Very, very unmixed feelings about his dog position. No, I always remember being on TMBS. I was like, it was before the episode started. I was at like the studio in Brooklyn, and Michael was like pre-recording an interview with him while I was like waiting, on the couch, and I could just hear all of the dogs barking in the background. And, that's like actually, honestly, one of my fondest Glenn Greenwald memories. But yes, right on dogs, wrong on Dugin. And yes, my cat, for unknown reasons, was disrupting that. He walked on the keyboard in just the right way to kick me off of the StreamYard. But in any case, I'm going to be watching not a lot, but just a little bit more of that interview with Deep State Kuba. In fact, I'm talking about this in the future tense, but I had to pre-record this because Kuba is in Europe right now. I think he was actually in France when I was talking to him. So the time zones do not work out for doing that live. So yeah, I recorded that a few days ago. And, we talk about kind of the broader situation with Russia and Ukraine. And, again, we watch some of the Dugin interview. We kind of talk about Duginism and sort of how not all critiques of Western imperialism are created equal. And we should actually be a little picky about the enemies of our enemies that we decide to make friends with. I think that line about how to a great power only other great powers are sovereign was particularly revealing. But and just in general, I mean, Dugin's just mystification at what Glenn was getting at, with that, that like, I've got to say, not terribly vigorous pushback, but some pushback about Ukrainian sovereignty. But in any case, so we are going to watch that in a little bit. We also have, we're probably going to save this to the end of the main show. We've also got some of Daniel Tutt, who was he did a guest appearance in my the capital class I teach through the GTAA Patron on Sunday afternoons, East Coast, mornings, West Coast. So he came in to talk to us a little bit about what Marx says about the lumpen proletariat. We've got that video. He's the second guest lecturer we've had in the class. The first one was Matt McManus when he was staying with me in LA. And then we've actually got Professor Richard Wolff coming in to talk to the class next Sunday. So I'm very excited about that. But first, I think it's maybe worth saying something about the article that, well, my God, sorry, I'm being distracted by my cat's Putinism. I should say I am Ben Burgess. This is Give Them an Argument. I am joined as always by our super producer, Jake Abbott, and our very talented graphic designer, J. Andrew World. But having said that, we should talk for just a minute about the article that I just wrote for Jacobin. So it's called Trump Tramples Free Speech to Shut Down Palestine Protests. And the timing was kind of horribly good with when this came out because it was written a few days ago. But, I don't know. I assume you guys make better life choices than I do. So probably none of you watched the pseudo State of the Union last week.
No, I was watching a documentary on the late David Johansen.
Same. No, actually, I was the closest.
With me.
Yeah. I made Andy watch. No, the closest I followed along were actually your Facebook posts. That was
okay.
The most
Yes,
basically like
same.
filming. I could tell it wasn't going well. You had a bit of substance there too, but I got the gist. It was like, okay, this is.
Yeah, I mean, it was pretty wild. It was a ride. There was a lot of baiting the Democrats about not clapping for various things. He referred to Elizabeth Warren to her face, Pocahontas. There was, Al Green was kicked out. He threatened to go to war with Denmark. Because that feels like hyperbole, even as the words come out of my mouth, but I really don't know how else to describe it.
Do you think that Denmark is like, should we do military preparations? Like,
does he want tulips that bad?
0.5%.
Is that Denmark, right?
He's serious. Yeah,
I think that might be Holland, but yeah, he said we need Greenland for our national security. Okay, he said that before. But then he said, and we're going to get it one way or the other. So if that's not a threat to go to war with Denmark, I don't really know how to read that. And he also threatened military intervention, as Matt says in the chat, against the country that I'm in right now, Mexico. He said, we put the cartels on the foreign terrorist organizations list officially. It's that's the same category as ISIS. That's not good for them. So again, there's a very strong insinuation there of taking the sort of action against the cartels that were taken against ISIS, which would mean drone strikes in Mexico and the absolute inevitability of cartel violence in the United States. I don't know how that would not happen under those circumstances. So there's a lot of crazy shit going on, but probably the thing that was most striking in context was that he said that free speech is back, that he's restored free speech. It's back.
Oh, good. Because we've been fighting.
Can finally
for
tell
that.
jokes.
Yeah, it's good. It's good because I've noticed that like when I hit the clubs, comedy clubs, like free speech is dead, man. So it's really cool to hear that it's back, and I can do my best material again. It's good to hear.
Yeah, I mean, I really loved it after the election. People were like, oh, great, we can say, retard and pussy again. It's like, do you think you couldn't? Like,
what do you think would happen if you said it?
Who was going to stop you? Right? Like that was all, it's that, that was always an option, right? Like, can say those things as much as you wanted to.
It's not really, yeah. So the same people who would take offense are also not going to now be like, now we like your comedy again, actually.
Exactly.
It's actually hilarious. I just was afraid to admit it.
Yeah. Now that we have permission, okay, that's actually really funny. Yeah. All right. Well, I guess the subject of exactly how back free speech is takes us to the opening argument.
Oh, wait. We have the, Ben's song first.
Gotta be streaming.
Debunk all of it. Logical analysis.
You're going to show us how to argue now. Go.
This is based on data from a bunch of different countries. There's abundant evidence that at this point.
Over the weekend, a graduate student at Columbia named Mahmoud Khalil was arrested by the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Service, ICE, and spirited off to a detention facility 1,000 miles away in Louisiana. Khalil was one of the most prominent leaders of the anti-war protests and encampments at Columbia last year. And he had been heavily targeted by people like Shai Davidai, who was loudly demanding that something just like this happen. And by the way, if you've made sufficiently better life choices than I have, that you don't know who Shai is. He is an assistant professor in the Columbia Business School, but that seems to be more of a side gig for him. His main job seems to be beefing with student protesters and being an absolute piece of shit on the internet. The version of American politics that, of course, we've all been living in for the last 10 years since Donald Trump came down the escalator in 2015 to announce his candidacy with a speech about Mexican rapists can sometimes feel a bit like a foreign country. I actually think we should resist the impulse to think about it that way. I'm actually going to be talking about that in a minute. But like I said, it can feel like a foreign country. Like this is something else. This is Trump world. The Rick and Morty episode where Rick has a device that he attaches to the TV to let them watch channels from alternate dimensions. Oh yeah, Morty, this is the channel from Trump world. That's the dimension where all of American politics revolves around the personality of this reality TV host. It gets boring. Let's watch something else. Of course, we can't change the channel. And after 10 years of living in Trump world, you start to learn some of the local rules and customs. Like if something spectacularly and shockingly terrible seems to have happened, give it a day, because about half the time, one or two news cycles later, it'll turn out that there was part of the transcript that got, missed or distorted, or, there was some complicated factor, and, libs will have moved on to the next thing, and, and they'll barely notice it. But this will just become part of the library of permanent grievances that Trump supporters carry around about how the lib media went after him. Of course, usually even initial reports, are only like 10% wrong. But, MAGA will nurse that 10% until the end of time. If Trump said we should kill some of the Mexicans, the media said that he said we should kill Mexicans. That will become part of MAGA lore because they left out the some. It'll be the some Mexicans hoax right next to the Russia hoax, the very fine people hoax, and all the other things they've decided are hoaxes, sometimes accurately, sometimes inaccurately, sometimes half accurately, whatever. So even though when it first came out that Mahmoud Khalil had been detained by ICE, I was disturbed, and I did post about it on all the social media platforms I use right after that happened. There was some part of me that was like, okay, is another shoe going to drop that's going to complicate this? Like, it's going to turn out that he was being detained for something unrelated after all, or, you know, maybe it would turn out to just kind of be messy and ambiguous, like was other stuff, but also maybe that other stuff was just an excuse that was really this. But nope. Fucking nope. Khalil was detained on Saturday night, I believe, and early Sunday. Secretary of State Little Marco posted this on Twitter. Do we have the Little Marco graphic? There we go. So he's linking there the AP story about Khalil being detained, and he just boldly announces, no pretense whatsoever, and I quote, "We will be revoking the visas and or green cards of Hamas supporters in America so they can be deported." And then today, we get this from Trump himself. This is his Truth Social graphic. And by the way, I think it had been a little while since I saw one of his Truth Social posts. It's kind of interesting to me that picture of himself he's got, his profile pic basically makes him look like the flag-faced murder tourist from the Purge election year. If you ever saw that movie, like it's basically the same face design. But in any case, Trump posts, quote, "Following my previously signed executive orders, ICE proudly apprehended and detained Mahmoud Khalil, a radical foreign pro-Hamas student on the campus of Columbia University. This is the first arrest of many to come. We know there are more students at Columbia and other universities around the country who have engaged in pro-terrorist, anti-Semitic, anti-American activity, and the Trump administration will not tolerate it. Many are not students. They are paid agitators. We will find, apprehend, and deport those terrorist sympathizers from our country, never to return again. If you support terrorism, including the slaughtering of innocent men, women, and children, your presence is contrary to our national and foreign policy interests, and you're not welcome here. We expect every one of America's college and universities to comply. Thank you." I love that Trumpy thank you at the end. Now, it's almost not even worth breaking down everything that's so grotesque about this statement, but I'm going to take just a minute to do so, if only because, you know, while our audience obviously skews very, very left, people have parents, grandparents, brothers, sisters, cousins, brother-in-laws, co-workers, whatever, who are pro-Trump, who nod along to shit like this, maybe even not pro-Trump, but still pro-Israel enough to nod along anyway. And I really think part of the service that's provided by this show should be that instead of just getting mad when you hear stuff like this in real life and telling the people in your life who believe it that it's bullshit, and then they tell you that, no, you're the one who's full of shit, I want to help people articulate a better response, to help them think about exactly what's wrong with this kind of nonsense. So even though I do want to get to a couple of broader points, first, let's just take a minute and break it down. Trump is announcing what amounts to an all-out war against basic free speech norms, and he's saying 5 things that I caught in that statement to justify it. All right, so let's get it back up on the screen. First, he says that the campus protests last year were pro-Hamas, pro-terrorist. Second, he's saying they were anti-American. Third, he calls them anti-Semitic. Fourth, he's claiming paid agitators, not really students. Fifth, and maybe this is just the first thing again, you know, put differently, but it's worth sort of addressing on its own. He's saying that because the protesters are pro-Hamas, that means they're pro-killing innocent men, women, and children, and that's why it's okay to use the power of the state to crack down on them. Okay, we can get rid of it. So let's just take a minute to go through these one at a time. First, pro-Hamas. Trump has often claimed over the years, going all the way back to when we first, you know, did our big Mandela effect shift into Trump world in 2015, that he was opposed to the war in Iraq. As it turns out, total horseshit. He supported the war in Iraq when he talked about the invasion, you know, being planned in 2002. I think Howard Stern or somebody probably asked him about it, and nobody could find him saying anything anti-war in 2003, but whatever. pretend he was telling the truth, that he really had the position on Iraq then that he wants to pretend he had now. Would that make him pro-Saddam Hussein? If not, why is protesting Israel's genocidal war in Gaza pro-Hamas? The anti-American thing is, in its own way, even weirder. Lots of MAGA people are against the war in Ukraine. Trump himself has played both sides of the street on that one. When he was president the first time, he actually shipped heavier weapons to Ukraine than Obama was willing to. And even now, it's not completely clear that he's really turning off the faucet for good instead of just playing hardball to get a better mineral deal for good old-fashioned neo-colonial resource extraction. But again, when he was running for president last year, he certainly wanted to portray himself as a Ukraine dove, as against Biden and Harris wanting to keep that war going. Well, the U.S. was backing Ukraine just like it's backing Israel. If wanting to stop Gaza makes you anti-American because the American, weapons and money keeping it all going, why exactly doesn't that apply to Ukraine? Anti-Semitic is even uglier and stupider than any of that. Brass tacks, anyone who lives in the real world, who spent any time at all around the pro-Palestine movement, Palestine solidarity movement in the United States, honestly, going back decades. I mean, I think the first Palestine protest I was ever at was like 2002 or something. But, certainly anybody who spent time around the encampments, which I certainly did, I spoke at the Princeton encampment last spring, knows that these protests are disproportionately Jewish, right? That I'm not saying majority, but certainly disproportionately, which makes sense, right? Because look, obviously, people see the atrocities going on in Gaza. They're infuriated about them. That's going to apply to students from all kinds of different backgrounds. But who's more likely to have already spent time wrestling with this issue and how they feel about, Israel and Palestine? Students who come from Hindu backgrounds, Catholic backgrounds, Mormon backgrounds, probably out of non-Palestinian, non-Arab, non-Muslim students, probably Jewish ones, right? Again, this is common sense, especially, of course, because of a feeling of revulsion about the idea that these atrocities are being carried out in some sense in your name. Paid agitators. Okay, well, if there is as many of them are paid agitators as Trump is saying, why did he start with one of those? Right? Why did he find a paid agitator and arrest him? Right? Why is the one that that he started out arresting and did a huge victory lap about arresting and is just trumpeting it everywhere? Why is that one a real student, not one of the paid agitators? Obviously, it is true that there are political organizations across the spectrum and on every issue that have people pay dues, they're paid staff members. But if you're saying the student protests are really filled with people who are pretending to be students who are paid agitators, and you're also saying you're going to do all these arrests and deportations to crack down on the protests, why not pick one of the paid agitators as your first test case? But really, the most grotesquely, offensively stupid part of this, to me, is the idea that, Trump is suggesting that free speech, at least for green card holders, by the way, when Khalil was first arrested, apparently he managed to get his lawyer on the phone, as my understanding from the articles that I saw about this, to talk to the ICE agents, and the ICE agents told him that his student visa was being revoked, and his lawyer told them, no, he's not on a student visa. Khalil has a green card, and they say, well, that's been revoked in that case. He's married to an American citizen who, by the way, is 8 months pregnant, just to make this that much more grotesque and anti-human. But if you're saying that free speech, at least when it comes to green card holders, stops at the threshold of justifying killing men, women, and children, let's really think about that standard for a second. Now, look, if anybody, whatever minority of people who might show up at protests actually are pro-Hamas, I think that's loathsome. I think I've been pretty clear about that in the last couple of years, my position on that. Maybe Khalil was one of those. I have to say, I have yet to see any evidence for it. I don't think it should matter whether he was or not. But I want to think about the standard itself. So this brings us to the graphic from Shai. Again, part-time business professor, full-time piece of shit on the internet. Shai tweets, and remember, he was somebody who was advocating for exactly this to happen, right? Shai tweets, like Mahmoud Khalil, I too am on a green card. Unlike Khalil, I don't support U.S. designated terrorist organizations take over university buildings and call for the genocide of anyone. He wasn't arrested for speaking up. He was arrested for breaking the conditions of his stay here. So I have a really simple question here. If we take seriously the standard that Trump enunciated in his Truth Social post, that free speech stops at justifying the slaughter of innocent men, women, and children, shouldn't Shai be deported? I mean, seriously, this guy could not be more enthusiastically in favor of Israel's war in Gaza. I mean, I think we showed last year the videos of him walking around Colombia trying to, get into confrontations with student protesters, with this giant Israeli flag draped around his shoulders like he was Captain Israel. And he's doing all of this as Israel is killing, at the very least, several tens of thousands of Palestinian civilian men, women, and children, and creating the world's largest population of child amputees through the constant bombing, even though, we're talking about a tiny strip of land in Gaza, 25 miles long, 6 or 7 miles across, something like that. And millions of Palestinian civilians were displaced from their homes at gunpoint. Again, even the most conservative figures for the number of civilians who were killed, never mind the sort of more realistic estimates that, take into account all the indirect deaths, which get you into hundreds of thousands of civilians. Even the most conservative estimates are still like way more civilians, even just in the first few months of the onslaught on Gaza than were killed, than even have been killed in like Russia's war in Ukraine the entire time, right? Those entire three years, right? There was a point like a couple of years in when it was announced with great fanfare that 10,000 Ukrainian civilians had died, which is certainly appalling. I have no time for anybody on the left who wants to do apologetics for Russian imperialism. In fact, that's a lot of what this episode is going to be about. But way worse than that in Gaza, unambiguously worse than that. So Shai is a cheerleader for all of that. I mean, it's, he's certainly advocated genocide in a much clearer way, I guarantee you, than anything that Khalil could possibly have said, right? Because there's an actual, non-hypothetical, real-world genocide going on, and here we have Columbia professor and green card holder Shai Davidai running apologetics for it. So if this is really the standard that if you are, advocating for the slaughter of innocent men, women, and children, you lose your free speech rights. You should be deported if you have a green card. Then sounds like Shai should be deported too. Now, I actually don't want to do that, not because my heart would bleed for anything had that happened to that dude particularly, but because I think we're all much better off in a society with free speech safeguards. The whole point of the First Amendment is that everybody is supposed to be able to have their say. And no matter how grotesque we find it, that's how you test whether you actually care about free speech, right? No authoritarian regime has ever censored anybody who was saying things the regime liked, right? The test is always whether you support it in cases when people are saying things you hate. which is why I don't want to deport Shai. But it doesn't seem to me that Shai himself, or certainly Trump or Marco Rubio, are willing to uphold that standard. And in a lot of ways, this should be really shocking. I mean, really shocking. Like, let's just look at the Trump Truth Social graphic one more time, just to remind people of what it says. Right? He says that we know there are more students at Columbia and other universities across the country who have engaged in pro-terrorist, anti-Semitic, anti-American activity, and the Trump administration will not tolerate it. Got that? Right? So notice what's missing from that sentence. He's not even saying, we know that there are other green card holders who have engaged in, anti-American, pro-terrorist, blah, 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 blah activity. He's saying, we know there are many other students who've engaged in this activity, and we will not tolerate it, right? He's saying that the protests themselves are what he will not tolerate. And so, arresting and deporting anybody he thinks he can get away with arresting and deporting is how he's going to crack down on, how he's going to stop tolerating it. Now, we should note that there is a district judge who has already issued a preliminary order stopping Khalil from being removed from the United States until the habeas petition has had time to be looked at. So it's possible that he will not get away with this. I really hope that he doesn't. But the fact that he thinks he can get away with it is really dark. It's really dark that we're crossing this kind of threshold of authoritarianism. Saying about student protests that he doesn't like, right? That's it's anti-American activity, and therefore he's not going to tolerate it. Sounds like something that the leader of the country would say in a dystopian science fiction movie about a slide into authoritarianism, right? I mean, that's what it is. So I just wanted to make two more points about this, and I'll wrap up with that. One is that I think that if we're going to be serious about how we push back against this stuff, right, which we certainly should, and I will note, by the way, for whatever it's worth, as far as certain kinds of intra-left arguments about, Trump and voting and, differences between the parties and all that stuff, we did tell you so. In fact, our main guest tonight, Dr. Kuba, co-wrote an article with me for Jacobin. I believe we have a graphic of this that was last summer called "Trump Wants to Purge the Deep State so he can weaponize it." That was all about the reasons that we were concerned that Trump might be more competently authoritarian in his second term than he was in his first term. And I've got to say, I suppose you can quibble with the but Trump has certainly been purging like crazy. That's been, that's been everywhere, right? I mean, that's the last six weeks of Doge shit. And certainly weaponizing, right? That's what we're talking about when we talk about things like the detention and attempted deportation of somebody explicitly because of his political views and his involvement in campus protests. No, don't tell me it's because of occupying the buildings or whatever, right? That they have if some Zionist students at Columbia had done a sit-in to demand that that there be more vigorous enforcement of policies to crack down on anti-Semitism, that Trump would be announcing that Shai was being deported if he joined them as a green card holder, right? Has nothing to do with anything, right? It's not, oh, you broke the rules by entering a campus building you weren't allowed into, right? It's the content of his politics explicitly and the fact that he was engaged in these protests the Trump administration disapproved of. This is something I said in my video that I did just before the election about why I do think that leftists in swing states I thought should do tactical nose holding. I reference our friend Branko Marčić's article about Trump threatening to do essentially a new Red Scare, right? So again, for what it's worth, told you. But moving on from that, right? I just want to make 2 points about this. First, if we're serious about pushing back and sort of mounting the best possible defense against the kind of authoritarian threats, and no, I don't think there's going to be, literal fascism that everybody who's been on screen is going to be in a concentration camp or anything. But I think there's a whole range of horrible authoritarian bullshit between here and there, and I don't think the slide is done yet. Right? I think it's going to get worse. And if we're going to push back against that in the most effective way, if we're going to respond to that in the most effective way, I think there are certain kinds of nonsense that American liberals often propagate, that the left, such as it is, often picks up. They're just being profoundly unhelpful. A lot of people in the last decade or two have really given up on, really moved away from the left's historic commitment to free speech. If you look at issues like people trying to stop visiting speakers from campuses they found offensive, or backing like tech censorship, even like leftists making libertarian arguments that censorship doesn't count if it's from the private sector, all of that was a huge mistake. I think a lot of the identity stuff that that a lot of people on the left leaned into was a huge mistake. And I think seeing this kind of safetyist rhetoric based on identity stuff that, Jewish students are unsafe, being weaponized to support massive censorship should be a wake-up call on all of that, right? I think we need to do better than any of that. Final point, and I actually just turned in an article about this for MSNBC. I assume that'll be out, imminently, the next day or so. I said before that Trump world can feel like a foreign country, but of course it's not. And this is something that's really important to get clear on, right? This is not critique of the left at this point, right? This is stuff that the left was right about at the time when no one was listening. Because what Trump is doing, right? I mean, again, I think in a lot of ways, the detention of Khalil does represent a sort of shocking new threshold in escalating authoritarianism, and certainly the way he justified it, right? That, anti-American activity is not going to be tolerated. But it didn't come from nowhere. And we've got to be clear about that. It's not that the United States had a wonderful, functional democratic culture, and then one sunny day, out of nowhere, Trumpism fell from the sky. You have to go back to September 11th, George W. Bush's response to September 11th, the Dems' support for George W. Bush's response to September 11th, Obama's continuation of what George W. Bush did in response to September 11th, Trump and Biden's continuation of that. And basically what we have had is more than 2 decades of bipartisan consensus behind the idea that if you say the magical word terrorism, that's a permission slip for undermining basic rights and freedoms. That once the word terrorism has been invoked, everything is fair game. And so we shouldn't be surprised when we see this kind of dystopian YA novel level bullshit being justified on the grounds that the victims were pro-terrorist, because this is exactly where that road always led.
Okay, and with that, we are now ready for the main event, which, as the title of the episode indicates, it is, although it doesn't indicate, is that it was previously recorded. If you're just joining us, conversation between Ben and Deep State Kuba. Ben, you're not deep. You're not even state. I guess you're just
no. I'm what they call a non-state actor.
Yeah, non-state Ben and Deep State Kuba, but they had a great conversation because of time differences on that has been recorded previously. So we're about to play that, unless at this point of the show is when we have any housekeeping or events that are coming up is when we discuss them. So anything that we got to discuss before getting to the main event? Yeah.
Yes. So I am doing a live podcast with Jason Myles on April 17th in San Francisco at the El Rio. So that's the El Rio in San Francisco at April 17th from 6 to 8 p.m. Tickets are on sale now. If there isn't a link in the description now, I'll make sure by the end of tonight there is one. Also, if you were a GTA patron, you should have already gotten an announcement of this that includes the discount code so you can get cheaper tickets. But I think this is going to be a lot of fun. It's going to be a bit of a homecoming for both of us. More so Jason, because he actually grew up in the Bay Area, and he lived there until not very many years ago. But I lived in San Francisco for a summer in 2009. I feel very old saying that. 2009, I spent a summer living in San Francisco, and I love that city very much in many ways. If podcasting paid bigger bucks, I would seriously consider living there, but the rent, as they say, is too damn high. So it's been a long time since I've been there, but I have very fond memories of dark bars with good whiskey selections and no televisions, which is definitely my favorite kind of bar. And, taquerias with like burritos the size of footballs, wrapped in tin foil with like really, really flaky tortilla crust. And many other wonderful things. So I am really looking forward to going back to the city. I am really looking forward to the podcast, which I think is going to be a very different kind of live podcast than stuff that Jason and I have done elsewhere. The sorts of things we did in New York and LA, which were great in their own way, but those were sort of, like variety shows that like lacked nothing but the elephants and the dancing girls. Whereas like this is, it's a live podcast. It could be a lot more intimate, in some ways, more like a meet and greet with the podcast recorded attached to it. Drinks will be flowing. I think it should be a really good time. The topic is Trump the end of history? So, obviously there's a range of subjects there, that we've all been spending a lot of time thinking about. So, come out to that if you're around.
And with that, we are going to play for you the conversation between Ben and Kuba.
All right. I am joined once again by Deep State Kuba, who was describing his travel itinerary to me earlier. I heard Brussels in there somewhere, so I could only assume that that he's ferrying like torture reports to important leaders of the EU. How are you doing, Kuba?
Now that the French nuclear umbrella has extended over the continent, I can sleep a little bit easier. There's nothing quite like the knowledge of certain atomic vaporization as a deterrent to my enemies. That gives me that solid 8 hours I need every night.
Yeah. So this is a sample of a broader thing that has been going on, which is that in the last dear God, it's been much less than 2 months that Donald Trump has been in office. The global order has been scrambled in some pretty amazing ways. I think the official U.S. stance, I believe, right now is that we might have to go to war with Denmark. That like for freedom, yeah, obviously, that's sure. Right, they're enemies of that. I watched Trump's pseudo State of the Union as we're recording this last week, few days ago, right? So I could write about it for Jacobin, and in there he said that we need Greenland for our national security. Okay, he's been saying that, but then he said we're going to get it, and I quote, one way or the other. which it's like, I don't know how many ways there are to read that. So that sounds like an implicit threat of war with Denmark, which is exciting. Where I am located right now, I am sitting in Rosarito, Mexico, where in that same pseudo State of the Union, he said that he bragged about having officially designated the drug cartels as foreign terrorist organizations, and said, and I quote, that puts them in the same category as ISIS. That's not going to be good for them, which again is very hard to read as anything but a threat of military force. I understand that where you normally live in Canada, that on the leaked information from the phone calls between Trump and Trudeau, he's talked about revisiting the border, like where exactly the border is set between the U.S. and Canada, and argued that like
an agreement from 1908.
That may not be legally binding, and maybe we can revisit that now. Panama. I forgot Panama. That we're going to retake the Panama Canal, which 50 years after agreeing to give it back, and 25 years after actually giving it back, is very hard to see how that would happen without some kind of military force being in the mix. And I will say, credit where credit's due, he did not talk about ethnically cleansing every single Gazan and turning Gaza into the Riviera of the Middle East in his speech to Congress. So I don't know if that one has sort of been quietly dropped from the agenda. Like
he's saving it for social media.
Okay. It didn't play with test audiences, what the situation is there. But so all of that's exciting, but those are all cases of possible fun new future wars that the United States might get involved in directly, right? I mean, obviously it's been very indirect, it's been essentially a co-belligerent in Gaza, but without actually boots on the ground yet. But the main reason I wanted to talk to you has to do with Eastern Europe, where it seems like if there was any hope, right, from the sort of like, I don't know, our perspective, kind of broadly anti-interventionist, that Trump might actually do something good, right? It was surely about Ukraine, that like, oh, well, maybe he'll like end the war in Ukraine. He kept saying he would. And what's we had this kind of Apprentice season finale-esque moment with Zelensky in the White House, but it doesn't. I just got to say, I've got the worst feeling in the pit of my stomach that this is not actually going to lead to peace. What's your sense of what's going on?
So it really did seem as though the American part of the White House dust-up with Zelensky was scripted. The way that J.D. Vance intervened at a particular moment, and that seemed to be a signal to ramp up the heat on what was a little testy, but more or less a congenial interaction between him and Trump. Almost a agree to disagree vibe going on between them on the merits of the Ukrainian case. After Vance intervenes, all of a sudden it's you're disrespecting the United States. Where's your gratitude? Get out of here. And it felt as though Trump still believed that he could end it with, "You're fired." And then that would be the season-ending cliffhanger, with all of us waiting to see what happens next. But I think that one major blind spot in Trump's worldview, and certainly in his foreign policy, is that he doesn't seem to realize that other actors exist, that the agents in the international space are not just him and the authoritarian leaders that he considers to be his co-equals, Putin and Xi, but other powers, even ones that are on the ropes like Ukraine, have some room for maneuver. They can coordinate with one another, and that they will respond to his threats and to his actions, potentially in ways that come back to cause enough harm for him to need to reconsider. We've seen this with tariffs, right? This is the second time that he's insisted that he's going to put Canada, put Mexico in their place, only to back down at his self-imposed deadline. And part of that has to do with the actions of the reaction of the U.S. markets, right? He's driven heavily by this business interests, financial interests. He listens to business lobbies, and seeing a market reaction like that gives him pause about his policy course. In terms of Ukraine, I think that he, believing that Zelensky had no cards to play, believing in a particular one-sided narrative about the course of the war, he imagined that the only alternatives for Zelensky were supine submission or self-destruction. And indeed, it's come out that through back channels, Trump's people have been talking with Yulia Tymoshenko, mooting the idea of triggering early elections as a means of getting Zelensky out, which is incidentally also one of the goals that Vladimir Putin and the Russian side have in terms of bringing Ukraine to heel and securing the most advantageous and most dominating type of peace settlement.
Simple-minded question about that scenario. I would think, right, that even if, like, I don't know how reliable like current opinion polling is in Ukraine, right? But like, even if we assume for the sake of argument, right, that like all else being equal, if there was an election tomorrow, Zelensky would have lost, right? That like I don't, even if we assume that, I would think that if the election was being held under obvious pressure from foreign powers, that would mean he would not lose, because there would be a rally around the flag effect and people would reelect him.
Absolutely. That's another blind spot that Trump has. The perception of his behavior also has consequences. People respond to what they perceive as imperial, domineering, bullying behavior. And foreigners, even ones who might be ideologically sympathetic to Trump's position, anti-globo homo, for instance, or name of country first type political leaders, well, you go after their country, their voters are going to take that personally. It's not going to be this slam dunk. You can't separate Trudeau from Canada.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, witness the way Trump has realigned all of Canadian politics, in the direction he presumably does not want. Yes.
This has been, it's ironic that he's accusing Trudeau of using tariffs to stay in power. One, Trudeau's already resigned. We're just waiting for Parliament to reconvene after the Liberals choose a new leader for him to adios off into the sunset. I guess adieu would be the more correct expression. But so he's actually mistaken, right? It's an impossibility for Trudeau to stick around. And boy, does he not want to. That guy is out the door. He's ready to move on to the post-presidency Barack Obama phase of his life. He's been chewed up and spat out. But also, the tariffs are not something that Trudeau invented. It is a completely unforced error on the part of Donald Trump. If he had just waited for the Canadian elections, he'd be sitting across the table from Pierre Poilievre, who, as viewers of the show will know, is a little mini Me Too. He's a Trump pick-me who has repeated the exact same talking points and who's in a lot of ways ideologically simpatico. And he was an absolute lock, 20-point lead for the conservatives, total electoral domination. The liberals were set to be wiped out. And now it's become competitive. It's extremely unlikely that the conservatives will have a majority government. If Trump doesn't stop it with the 51st state stuff, then he's going to hand the liberals another term. And in the Ukrainian side, Trump had those statements that Zelensky is a dictator, he has postponed elections, he refuses to have elections, he has a 4% approval rating. And it's true that compared to the early stages of the war, just like George W. Bush's approval ratings immediately after September 11th, Zelensky had a very, very high ceiling, starting point, and the grinding, destructive, soul-crushing nature of the conflict for Ukrainians has meant that those have eroded down below 50%, perhaps even lower. And it might entirely be possible that in a completely free and fair election, Zelensky might not be selected again by the Ukrainian people. However, he's certainly gotten a significant bump after the White House encounter, which has been read worldwide, not even limited to Western countries and Ukrainian allies, but every public that has seen that interaction has seen a war leader, somebody with personal courage and conviction, standing up to the domineering, sneering bullying of a great power bent on his humiliation and the submission of his nation. And Ukrainians obviously are taking that personally, and they're being reminded of why they liked and respected Zelensky in the past. After that performance, and especially after the pledges of support that he's received from European leaders, Canada, other traditional allies, Zelensky is in a better position than ever, right? Single-handedly, Trump has again revived the electoral chances of his most ardent opponent in Ukraine, and we're unlikely to see those elections come about because under martial law, which is going to be the case until there's a conclusion to this conflict, Ukrainian law does not require or even permit holding national elections. But I think that Trump, with the withdrawal of aid and with the withdrawal of intelligence sharing, he's setting the stage for a plan B, which would be the battlefield defeat of Ukrainian forces. Now, that's not really what we had in mind in terms of a negotiated peace agreement in the Ukraine. And at this point, from very early on, for humanitarian reasons and because of the futility of the conflict, from my perspective, I wanted to see a quick end to the war,
Sure.
ideally with minimal concessions from the Ukrainian side. At this point, I just don't know if that's feasible.
And it's worth pointing out, I think, that like, look, take all this with a grain of salt, because like, you know, if there had been, if the U.S. had been willing to take a more, active role in negotiating a settlement, like January 2022, right? When by the way, Bernie Sanders, wrote that op-ed in the Guardian urging them to do so. Like what everybody would or wouldn't have accepted there is somewhat, it's not entirely knowable, right? Like we can speculate. If the negotiations that spring that did happen had, again, I think if like Western powers had taken a different attitude towards it, so
particularly Boris Johnson, I
Right,
think that this could be chalked up to the interventions of one particular leader.
Yeah, totally, right. And so Like if that, but it's like, I do feel like, at least in that case, right? Like I think this much we could be sure about, right? So it's like, I think that, that, if the war ultimately ends, there is a worse scenario, which I think you were starting to get at, and we'll get into in a second, right? But like, assuming that the war does ultimately end with some sort of, treaty signing, occasion, or even if there's no treaty, even if it's like some sort of awful Korean War stalemate, right? Some kind of like armistice, right? Then it's still like what could have been achieved in with like peace negotiations in like spring 2022. Like I think one thing we can be sure about is that whatever that settlement would have been way better for Ukraine than like anything that would happen now. If there actually was a peace settlement now, which, as I said, I'm very pessimistic about, right? And certainly anything that would happen if like the war keeps on going for another year, another 2 years, etc. Right? So it's like I think that this is just like whatever. I think it is just kind of worth saying at a basic moral level, right? That it's like if the war eventually ends up with a peace settlement, and by the way, I mean, all else being equal, I would prefer a peace settlement where Ukraine gave up less, because I do think it matters that they're the ones who got invaded, right? Like it's not that they didn't invade Russia, but if the war eventually ends up with the peace settlement, it's like, look, I would have preferred that happen a million dead people ago to happening now. And I would prefer it happen now to a million more dead people, in the future. But again, this, doing that, sort of attempt to do the apprentice, you're fired thing to one of the belligerent heads of state seems extremely unlikely to me to like actually lead to the fighting stopping. And it does seem like, right, from my, very non-expert eyes, I mean, this is one of the reasons I wanted to have you on to talk about this, that it does seem like there is a worse scenario maybe than any of this, right? Which is just that, okay, the, Ukraine, like, let's say, like, there's just no more US aid, right? At all, right? From this point onward. But also, the Ukrainian population, rallies around Zelensky for all the reasons you were talking about, and various European, powers, contribute some hardware, to more than they have been, to Ukraine, so they can continue fighting, but like in a somewhat worse position than they would be with US aid, and then they just kind of slowly and bloodily lose. Right? That strikes me as like the worst of all worlds.
Oh no, it gets worse.
Okay, give me the worst one.
Another scenario that Trump has opened the door for would be, now European powers no longer have any trust in NATO as a deterrent to Russian aggression, and no longer have any trust in the United States as a security partner. In very short order, I expect that there'll be announcements made, in addition to the extension of the French nuclear umbrella over the rest of Europe, that a thoroughgoing remilitarization of Europe is going to take place.
Right.
Increased military spending, increased budgets. I think that this may be inevitable. I think that there's a way to do it which might reduce the harm that remilitarization would bring, a way to do it that might strengthen the continent. But there's also the preferred neoliberal, let's gut the welfare states approach, in which the quality of life and the inequality in the European Union both drastically deteriorate. And the newly energized European security forces buttress Ukraine, and do so in such a way that triggers an escalation into a general war between Europe without non-NATO Europe, Europe without the United States, and the Russian Federation, perhaps involving an exchange of nuclear weapons.
Okay, that would be worse.
Strategic.
Yeah, that would be much worse. The worst non-World War scenario.
This would just be a Eurasian war.
Yeah, okay, fair enough. That the worst non-general Eurasian war scenario that Ukraine just sort of slowly, bloodily loses. I also do want to say one other thing about that, just because I'm not oblivious to the fact that part of the online left, including inevitably part of the audience for the show, has drifted in the way of these things from a sort of entirely good and defensible pro-peace position to a sort of outright pro-Russian position. I think it is what it is. And so I know there might be some people who heard what I just said and thought, oh, well, Ukraine lost, at least the war would be over. So maybe, that's not the worst thing. And I would just gently suggest that if anybody thinks that means the war would be over, they should look into the history of the last couple decades of U.S. foreign policy, right? When the U.S. rolled into Kabul, that did not mean the war in Afghanistan was over.
Similarly, you might want to ask the Irish about what it's like to be dominated by a neighbor that thinks of you as just a degenerate form of themselves.
Right. Yeah, no, totally. And also Ireland is a good, even on the pragmatic point, Ireland is a good reference point because this is this is the fact that the British Army, had the capacity, to hold Dublin right until the early 20th century, or Belfast, afterwards, did not actually mean there was no conflict or killing going on. So,
and
something to think about.
And also, at the beginning of this conflict, all right, I'm broadly sympathetic. I'm in broad agreement with the Jeff Sachs dressing down at the EU Parliament that this conflict stems from a great deal of geopolitical malpractice on the part of the United States and NATO.
Sure.
The Western powers should not have kept trying to expand their security sphere of influence into territories that were of extraordinary sensitivity to Russia. And even doing so, they should have just quit while they were ahead.
Right.
Yeltsin and Putin, they tolerated the absorption of former people's republics like Poland and even former Soviet republics like the Baltic states. But Ukraine was always going to be a red line, and Russia did everything in its power to communicate that clearly and repeatedly.
Right. Going back to Yeltsin and before, yes.
Yes, absolutely. But we're past that now.
Right.
The situation has changed. All of the parties have been transformed, not least of all because of this experience. The Russia of Yeltsin or early Putin, which was, I'd argue, looking for a constructive relationship with the West, is gone, right? Russia, at this stage, considers the European Union, not NATO, but also the European Union, as an enemy and a rival, and is seeking its subversion. For instance, its support for the Alternative für Deutschland and other far-right parties within Europe.
Which just to connect some dots from something you said a minute ago, is one of the reasons that if Europe rearms by gutting the welfare state, I mean, above and beyond all of the sort of obvious kind of socialist reasons to be horrified by that, even in terms of the European libs' own core goals, right, would just be catastrophically counterproductive. I mean, you want to enable the rise of the far right, which has already been rising anyway, right?
Mhm.
Like I can't imagine a better way to do it than that.
Absolutely. I think that the Macron-style neoliberal elite within Europe believe that they can capture the energy of a rally around the flag effect by making the war in Ukraine an existential threat to the very security of Europe and make Putin a Cold War style antagonist around which you can rally for collective sacrifice, including cutting the welfare state. I think that that is a very dangerous path to tread. Also, and this is the part of me that, and this is my consultant brain, it's absolutely needless. The problem with the weakness in the European economy has to do with slack in resource utilization. There's factories that are closed. There's certain problems with energy provision and international competitiveness. But in some ways, the Trump tariffs are a bit of a boost because they reduce competition from the United States. And they also allow you to shift resources from the export sectors that are most likely to be hit by those trade restrictions to rearmament and domestic mobilization. You can do that without cutting into the welfare state. You've got wiggle room before you need to worry about making those kinds of decisions about resource allocation because there's idle resources available. There's also other alternatives. You can print money, and it doesn't work if you're a country with a small currency, but the euro is one of the major international reserve currencies. You also have many friendly powers that'll happily dump US dollars and replace them in their foreign currency reserves with freshly printed euros. There's also the
feels like right about now, America's neighbors might both be willing to look into that.
Absolutely, exactly. And it has the secondary benefit of harming the US economy and threatening Trump's goals, which require him to bank on the premium that comes with being the world's reserve currency. Without that, he can't do the deficit spending that he needs to extend his tax cuts and go through with his domestic policies. So you're getting at, you're both creating space for your own rearmament and undercutting the bullying power of the United States. Finally, you can go after your own inequality by targeting the highest net worth Europeans through either a wealth tax, or if that feels like a bridge too far, just convert portion of their fortunes above €1 billion into long-term bonds. You know, during World War II, war bonds were an essential component of the American political economy of rearmament. We can do that in Europe as well. If you push all of the costs down onto the mass of the public through gutting the welfare state, the very thing that people like most about being European, then you are creating the very conditions for anti-systemic mobilization. And, you know, God willing, it'll just be on the left. Of course it won't be. But even if
I'd love to believe that, you know, that Die Linke, for example, is going to be able to capture the bulk of the anti-establishment energy in Germany. But like, I think you have to live in the real world a little bit here and say that's not going to happen right now, right? Like they're just not positioned to do that, right? I mean, the fucking AfD is going to do that.
Exactly. Yeah. And so European libs, if they're really considering using the welfare state, cuts to the welfare state, creating a kind of security austerity, and hoping that anti-Putin moralism and rally around the flag will save them, well, I mean, talk to Kamala Harris, right? See how well that worked out in. See how even James Carville at this point is saying that what Democrats need is their version of Bernie Sanders, and
gosh,
this is a time, frankly, I think that given the security realities within Europe and the threat of resurgent far right, the United Front is worth reviving, but it cannot be a united front where liberal parties just expect the unearned deference of the left. It needs to be a give and take, or the liberals and the leftists will be reunited in political marginalization when the AfD comes to power.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's like, it's fine. It's fine to say, like, when push comes to shove, right? Hold your nose and, do what you need to do in the, second round of the French election or whatever, right? But and for the record, I think that's the correct position, but like, also the thing about voters is that they don't do things just because you tell them to, right? I mean, that they have to like, I remember actually in that scenario, right? When there was the it was down to Macron and Le Pen and the Mélenchon, right? The left wing standard bearer sort of said, something like very coy in French, like, well, I'm going to vote and it's not going to be for Le Pen, right? That, like, so it's like that was it's just, I think that it's like, yeah, I think like some of what he was trying to do is like just kind of navigate that, because it's like if you sort of shake your finger at people and tell them that they have to, right? Like it turns out they don't actually have to, right? Like it's they're gonna, like, you can say they should do it, right? But that they still can just not do it, right? Like you have to give them something if they're if they're actually going to do it.
Precisely, and Macron has undercut the ability of the French left to deliver to him in the second round by freezing them out of parliamentary processes, even though they're the largest single bloc in the French Assembly.
Yeah, exactly, right. That there's you can't have like it's like if he's making clear that he thinks like the absolute worst case scenario would be you coming to power, right? Like, they'll do anything to block that from happening, let you form a government. Then yeah, I mean, even like you can be as pragmatic as you want all day long, right? Like it's just there's just no guarantee that your voters are gonna come along with you. So the sort of, in a way, I feel like some of what we've been talking around is that like, if you think about sort of the end of the Cold War to the present, right? We had this period of I mean, I think people sort of misuse the word neoliberal in a way that, like, what they really mean is like the sort of progressive wing of neoliberalism, right? But that, right, had like a certain kind of hegemony that they could sort of run everything for a long time, more or less, right? View from 10,000
The
feet.
rules-based international order.
Yeah, right. And of course the rules didn't really apply to the rule enforcers, but whatever, we all know that, right? So this, we kind of lived in that world for a couple of decades, and then things have been unraveling since then, and which in principle sounds like good news, except for the reasons we were just talking about, right? The left has mostly been too weak to capture the benefits of that. And in that course, I mean, I'm not going to do the hackneying thing and quote the Gramsci about the time of monsters, right? But like, we've been getting all sorts of like bizarre little realignments, and as part of that, it seems to me that a lot of people have smart people, people who have some good instincts, on some subjects, sort of prioritize being anti-establishment above absolutely everything, and and kind of are willing to not look very hard at, like, okay, if you're anti-establishment, what are you for, right? What's the thing that you want, right? Like, we know what you're against. What do you want? All of which is just me setting up one of the strangest things that I have seen in a long time, right? Which is your fellow GTAA alumnus, Glenn Greenwald, has been on the show a few times over the years. Sat down for this, I have to say, oddly chummy interview with, I think, at least within the category of people you can vaguely call like philosophers or whatever, one of my candidates for one of the worst people on the planet within that category, Alexander Dugin, and
The Russian Jordan Peterson.
Yeah, more or less, right? It's the guy in the alley who's selling. No, it's just like Jordan Peterson. It's better. So, right. So yeah, I just want to show you a little bit of that. So this is a clip that Glenn put on his YouTube channel with the fascinating name, "The Globalists Are the Racists." Russian analyst, I like that that's how we're describing him, Russian analyst Alexander Dugin on the loss of cultural identities.
About doging Russia. Russia needs a doging. As you might know, I live in Brazil. I'm American, but I live in Brazil, and I have for many years. And over the last 2 months, you have this right-wing populist movement led by Jair Bolsonaro, and they talk all the time now about U.S. aid and where money has gone, because there's been a lot of U.S. aid money into Brazil as well. And you have now right-wing conferences in the United States, and they're often attended by right-wing leaders from every continent, from Europe, from South America, from everywhere. And it is kind of ironic, because all of these right-wing populist movements are very nationalistic in the way they describe themselves, and the way you're talking about this Russian identity, Russian sovereignty, Russian patriotism. But at the same time, maybe because of the internet, maybe for other reasons, there seems to be a very close linkage, almost like it's like an international movement as well, where populists and nationalists are linking up together increasingly and forming a kind of worldwide movement. Is that how you see Russian nationalism? You're very tapped into the right-wing discourse in the United States. I can see that. And I see that in a lot of other populist and nationalists as well. There's a little tension, because it's the idea is we want an expression of our own country, our own culture, our own history, our own borders. But at the same time, it seems increasingly, I don't want to say like globalism, but it does seem to be an internationalist movement as well. Is that how you see it?
Yes, I agree. Because that is interesting that being European, Americans, Brazilian, and Russians, we have the same threat of the loss of our identity and canceling of our cultural values, traditions, because the globalists they promote the kind of postmodern relativism. So no values, no gods, everything is optional, and there is no organic identity. All identities are just the game. So you could choose any identity you prefer, and all the values are relative, and so there should not be national states, national culture, no civilizations, only one civilization, liberal, end of history, and so on. And that is directed against Russia, against Russian understanding of what Russia, Holy Mother Russia, is, what is our tradition, our religion, our value. The same, it is against United States of America, including against those conservative part of it, very, very large, as we see, that goes against the majority of European population under the rule of globalists. The same, I think, for for Brazilian people. So I see that this coordination or beginning of coordination of these conservatives, and the people. I don't like term nationalist because I am not nationalist. I don't think that is good term that fits for Russia, because we had here much more a civilization state with different nations.
Not just a nation state.
No, absolutely not. Never nation state. Soviet Union wasn't national state. A Russian Empire.
The Soviet Union also wasn't Russian.
Right. Yeah, it is really odd how, like, in different ways, everybody seems to have forgotten, like, what the Soviet Union was, right? That like, both in, like, the really stupid ways that you'll see, like, lib commentators, like, who will, like, slip up and talk about communist Russia, as, last 35 years didn't happen, but like also the way that like Russian nationalists have just sort of decided to grandfather in the Soviet history, and like
including Saint Joseph of Georgia, right?
Yeah.
Great helmsman for Christ.
Exactly, right. That just. Which is just really like, it's like, yeah, it's like, it's like all the people who like think what you think were, I mean, if they were caught, they were in gulags, right? Is this what are you talking about, right? Like, this is, and people.
What he's describing has a Soviet era term. It's Great Russian Chauvinism, and it, like you said, got you sent to the gulag.
Yeah. All right. Let's keep watching.
Wasn't national state. So nationalism, maybe for Western country, it is normal term. For our country, is the wrong term. So
this is insanely offensive to Poles, Balts, right. It's not as though the Chechens feel particularly welcome in this multinational civilization state, right? The Russian Empire that he's obviously calling back to, the pre-Soviet Russian Empire, that he imagines is this multi-ethnic, multinational civilization state, this world of many nationalities, was referred to by Poles, Finns, and the people who experienced it as the prison house of nations.
Yeah, I mean, Lenin famously called it that, right? That's which again goes to the strangeness of like trying to assimilate this, without like, romanticizing the very many things about it that shouldn't be romanticized, right? Like this very, very like explicitly multinational, like authoritarian socialist project, right? That existed, existed from the Russian Revolution, to Gorbachev, right? That again, would imprison people for great Russian chauvinism, right? Like trying to equate that with the Russian Empire. I mean, it's like, again, certainly the self-understanding of,
frankly, as a Slav, what he's describing is the Mongol yoke, but with a Vladimir instead of a Chinggis on top.
Describe me as ultra national, but I'm not nationalist at all. So that's just irony. But I think I agree. There should be a kind of coordination between the peoples and the countries and the movements defending their own deep identity, their own civilizational values. And
because there's a common enemy, as you see it, which is globalism.
Globalism, yes, not the West, because not China, not socialism, just globalism. Globalism, it could be Islamic, it could be Chinese, it was
usually it is Jewish.
That was the kind of global.
Yeah. Yeah, I've been holding back from making the usual jokes about how, as somebody who's, ethnically part globalist, you know. I mean, it's like celebrated some globalist holidays here and there, you know, family, but like, what a really grazed globalist. So I don't know how much of this is about me exactly. Yeah, no,
I'm
it's
sick of the globalists and their bagel shops.
yeah, no, it's the you know, and they're yeah, they're loud and they're pushy, you know. It's the hate, you know, hate those globalists. Yeah, no, it's really it's like what he's laying out here is something that uh is unfortunately not just the eccentricity of this one sort of strange Russian thinker, right? I mean, that this is without like, you know, exaggerated how much of an influence he is on Putin or whatever, which is, you know, which I think is probably often overstated. I honestly don't think that, you know, I honestly don't think that Putin is like deeply ideologically driven, you know, in general, but like but like, look, forget that. I mean, like what he's saying is what Elon Musk said to the AfD, more or less, right? I mean, that when he went to Germany, right, that they have that we need to that it's like really important to preserve, you know, these different civilizations against being diluted, you know, because you let in too many of the wrong kinds of people, right? That this is the and I mean the reason I wanted to like share this particular clip, you know, like it's one of the few clips he posted for this interview. I think the whole thing is on Rumble. Is that there is this sort of like, you know, even being generous and and not reading the word globalist the way it's often hard for me not to read it. And certainly, I will say, every time I go on Elon Musk's social media platform and say things along these lines, I always get a bunch of people in the comments telling me that I don't understand because I'm a triple parentheses rootless cosmopolitan. But even being generous and not reading it that way, right? I mean, this is the sort of thing, like the way.
I got stopped by Lubavitchers today.
Oh yeah,
yeah, they were disappointed. I had hated to break it to them, but
it's like, no, sorry, just Eastern European, not Jewish. Yeah, easy mistake to make. Yeah, it's like it's even not reading it that way. Like, I would still say that the same way that like Babel famously called like anti-Semitism the socialism of fools, that like you sort of have the structure of socialist critique of capitalism, but instead of talking about this like impersonal domination of economic forces, say, it's just, you know, the Jewish bankers, right? You know, are the ones who are ripping us off. I think that this is kind of the anti-imperialism of idiots, that it's that you sort of say, okay, well, there's some sort of problem that people have with, you know, kind of globe spanning imperial domination, and I know what it is, right? It's the culture, right? It's the that our traditional cultures are being eroded. That must be the issue, right? That it's actually, you know, that really we just have a right to make sure that, you know, that like, you know, somehow like that you can like freeze cultural change and stop it, you know, from happening, because I mean that's like really the thing he's saying is being threatened by the globalist cosmopolitans and all of this.
What he, I think in particular, what he objects to, what somebody like Elon Musk objects to, is the notion that people might defect from his team to Globo Homo. Right? If you asked him, do you really care about, say, the traditional ancient customs, folkways, identities of the Arabs? And do you really, really want them to dig deep and stick to their inheritance all the way back to Muhammad and beyond? And that entire part of the world should just be a homogenous, Arabski mir, which might have minority vilayets in it, that live in servile dimitude very happily because they acknowledge their place inside of it. And every Muhammadan Abdullah born in a Muslim family, a Muslim Arab family, will stick to that way of life from here to eternity. Or maybe some of them become gay DJs in Beirut and we don't have to worry about them like being on Team ISIS anymore. Then in an unguarded moment, he might be like, in that case, maybe global homo not so bad. But what he objects to is the notion that good Russian Ivans might decide that all things being equal, with the option of choice, with the ability to create their own identity, to pick and choose culturally the things that they like, they don't like,
They like DJs.
That they might not be on his team, right?
Yeah.
Similarly, I think that when you read Elon Musk's, you should be proud of being German. People should be having more babies, that kind of thing. What he means is white people.
Right.
And what he means is, and what he objects to is that white people, probably in particular white women, might make choices that he disapproves of. And he would like that birth identity to be set, immutable, and enforced. And the threat.
Lord, what did Grimes do to that, man?
He managed to get Grimes to tweet that it should be okay to be proud to be white. So I think that
it's good. Compromise is important in a relationship.
Yeah. I think the arrow of causality may have gone the other way. And frankly, I hope that she's getting the deprogramming support that she needs.
Yeah.
But
I mean, it's obviously selective, right? I mean, it's like, look, you're really telling me, it's like, well, okay, look, I mean, concretely, right? In World War I, this sort of like insane maximalist thing that like, like the Tsar was like dreaming about and talking about was that he was going to retake Constantinople, right? From the Turks. So it's like, oh, you telling me that had happened, Alexander Dugin would have been disappointed?
And that he would have incorporated the conquered Turks as welcome brothers in the Ruski Mir, right? Like the dreams of these figures are ones of hierarchy and ones in which minorities, to the extent that they're tolerated, know their place, and that the dominant culture is able to not only express itself, because under Boris Yeltsin, there was nobody standing in the way of the Russian Orthodox Church. There was nobody preventing you from cosplaying as Alexander Nevsky. You could have done all of the revivalist Slavophile stuff that you wanted. But the point was that the state didn't enforce it. The state didn't mandate it. The state didn't elevate it. That's what they're fighting for. And interestingly, the People's Republic of China represents a counterpoint here, right? I'd say that in keeping with the notion of multipolarity, we have three different ways of accommodating multi-ethnic, multicultural identity and coexistence in Russia, the West, and China. In the West, I don't know if I wouldn't characterize it the way that Dugin does, but there is an individualistic turn. Sure. There's different strains within it, but there's an idea that you can choose and fabricate your own identity, and that traditionally dominant identities should not be privileged, right? There's some dispute as to the level of abnegation and self-flagellation that should come with those identities. I would argue that that's a very self-defeating path to go down, but there's certainly you're not prohibited from saying Merry Christmas, and there's no law against being white.
Yes. This is the it's always that one has always amazed me, that like the people who pretend that there is some sort of taboo even against saying Merry Christmas. It's like, this is the I don't know. I mean, I mean, okay, granted, now I'm sort of living in Mexico, but I've lived in America for the vast majority of my life. I have never heard anybody take offense at being told Merry Christmas, even if they didn't celebrate Christmas, right? Like, this is, sometimes people say Happy Holidays because they're just kind of trying to cover their bases, and that's a way of saying, Merry Christmas or whatever, right?
Exactly.
Like,
precisely. Precisely.
Yeah, no, and it's like you were just talking about being stopped by Kabod earlier, right? I mean, it's like this is you can be, I mean, this is always the thing. Like, this is when I'm like, I don't know, arguing with my personal friend and ideological friend of Sora Abamare, right? That they have that's like, it's like, I don't understand this is the sort of thing that I like most fundamentally don't understand about like social liberalism. It's like, literally nobody is fucking stopping you, right? This is you can go as like Benedict option as you want, right? Like, and
the Amish still exist.
Yeah, the Amish still exist. Nobody is stopping them. Like who is like, nobody is like going down to go on like missions into Amish country to like try to convince them to change their genders and and start using toasters. Right,
Mormonism is flourishing, right? It's genuinely a condition where that very individualism, which the majoritarian culture, especially majoritarian chauvinists, might find threatening, is actually one which every other kind of traditionalist is protected by, right? Every other form of identity has their selfhood secured by the very institutions that the majoritarian chauvinist complains about. And granted, some of it's annoying, some of it's self-defeating. You can complain all you want about the HR aspect of DEI, and sure, yeah, all of that. However, there's the existence of trad wives on Instagram, right? The real limiting factor in the identities that you can choose, how traditional you want to be, is political economic. It is not about some sort of cultural coercion. In China, which is a third example, and I think that what we need to accept in a multipolar world is that these systems aren't going to be mirror images of one another. Everybody wants bipolarity, good guys and bad guys, Soviets and Americans, Eastern Bloc, Western Bloc, Axis and allies. But you're going to have multiplicity of different ideological frameworks, most of which, depending on your side, will seem equally unattractive, right?
Sure.
And I think that one problem that the liberal West will have to face is, how do you move from a position where you are generally universally recognized, or you could universally promote yourself as the good one, to one where it's legitimately, there's a multiplicity of different systems, of different frameworks that you're going to have to coexist with. And that climb down is going to be difficult. It, I think, will be actually facilitated by the removal of the United States from that bloc, because you no longer have the majoritarian superpower backing that particular model. But it will, the Europeans will have to, for instance, accept the fact that you're going to have to pragmatically deal with countries that have been bad guys in your books for a generation. And but the Chinese model, just to wrap up the point that I wanted to make, borrowed heavily from the old Soviet system, where there was official recognition for every minority in the country. You have ethnicity as a category that might be written in your documents, in your papers. Sometimes that is advantageous, sometimes it isn't.
Sure.
And there is a overall framework for the legal recognition of all these types, and there isn't that much enforcement of what you do within them. And Dugin's form, like
For the most part, I think we should say, right? Like this
For the
is
most
there are some like dramatic exceptions, but yes.
the and those dramatic exceptions, for instance, Tibetans,
Yeah.
and this is something that you notice. I recently spent some time in China in Yunnan province, and Yunnan, the northern part of Yunnan, is majority Tibetan. It has a very different trajectory and a very different contemporary situation than Tibet proper, in that during the Long March, the Red Army, the Chinese communists, Mao Zedong personally, were welcomed in the Tibetan area of Yunnan, and the first communist district or provincial leader of that area was also the leading Lama. You see his photograph in the Lamasery, and you see his photograph in the communist Long March Museum. Same guy. Because that Tibetan community was politically aligned with the CCP, they enjoy a very strong relationship with the contemporary People's Republic. In Tibet proper, it's a conquered country. The Tibetan expressions of Tibetan identity are seen as seditious. And yes, there's very heavy repression. There's no question about that. Ideally, we'd be in a situation where that the Yunnan province Tibetan deal would be extended universally. And many minorities have a relationship with Beijing that's closer to Yunnan Tibetans than Lhasa Tibetans. But yes, very much so. It is unequal, but aspirationally.
Yeah, and like most, like, I mean, to underline your point, right? I mean, it's like, yes, there's Tibet, there's the Uyghurs, right? Like all this is obviously awful, but also, like, there are an awful goddamn lot of ethnic minorities in China, right?
Yes.
And in the great majority of cases, they're not dramatically repressed in these ways.
Yeah. Similarly, if you look at the history of Great Britain, the Scots got a much better deal than the Irish.
Right.
And that largely had to do with political and economic also the religious element, but
sure.
To be fair, what Dugin is suggesting is a third form of multi-ethnic coexistence, which involves a hierarchy, not a bureaucratic legal sorting system like China or an individualistic system like the West, but something that's most similar to Ottomanism or the early caliphates, where the majoritarian culture is on top of a hierarchy, and it monopolizes political power and authority, and minorities, those wonderful, colorful people without whom this would be such a drab and uniform world, get to keep their costumes in their local villages as long as they know their place. Right. And I don't know to what extent people identify with the majoritarian or the minorities in any of these cases, but like, if you run the Rawlsian thought experiment, right? Imagine yourself as a Chechen, right? Imagine yourself as the bottom of the heap in these different societies, and it's not that attractive necessarily for anyone. The difference being the extent to which you can escape it.
Totally right, and it's like, look, I mean, this is so. I mean, just to maybe like pithily like reframe this. I mean, it's like this is Dugin is saying, "Oh, I'm not a nationalist," because like I'm talking about a civilizational state, and it's going to have all these different like nations in it. But notice that he also very frequently refers to that civilization as Russian civilization.
Yes, and those other nations within it, they obviously have a status that's not quite the same.
Yeah, I mean, it's look, it's not Chechen civilization; it's Russian civilization. The Chechens just live in it.
Yeah, and sometimes they need to be reminded.
Yeah, exactly. All right, we will put out the full thing as a clip, but we didn't want to go any longer than so we'll put that out probably. I'm guessing on like Friday, right? We'll put out the full conversation, and in fact, we'll probably have Kuba back on even to do a part 2 of it because we didn't get a chance to watch as much Dugin as I was hoping we would, but the conversation was really interesting. But we are going to cut that off there for tonight because we don't want to keep our post-game guest waiting too much longer. So our post-game guest is going to be Yuri Rashkin, who is a radio host, does quite a bit of both Russian and English language material, and actually debated Dugin a few years ago. So we're going to talk to him about that. And as I said, we're already at the hour. I don't want to keep him waiting too much longer, but I did promise a little bit of Daniel Tutt, and I am going to give you a little bit of Daniel Tutt. Now, it's not going to be that much, but this too, there will be a longer version of it coming as a clip. So I'm just going to kind of try to set this up to give you just a little bit of context, and then we'll go to we'll give you just a little taste of what he actually says in his contribution. But first, this is going to be me at the beginning of the clip. So this is from my capital class. We've been very slowly going through chapter 25, which is a very long chapter. So this was our like third, fourth session on that. And so I am building up to what Marx briefly says there about the lumpen proletariat, and then bringing in Daniel as a guest expert. Working class, and of course, the working class doesn't make up the whole of the non-means of production owning, non-prosperous population. So Marx writes, finally, the lowest sediment of the relative surplus population dwells in the sphere of pauperism. Apart from vagabonds, criminals, prostitutes, in short, the actual lumpen proletariat, this social stratum consists of 3 categories. And before we do the 3 categories, this is really worth noting and lingering on. The phrase the lumpen proletariat is going to be at least somewhat familiar to any of you who have looked into Marx's more journalistic and, immediately political writings, the class struggles in France, the 18th Brumaire, all that stuff. It also, post-Marx, Marxist debates, for example, about Marx is clearly not using the term in this kind of very broad way.
Sorry about that. Short technical glitch on there.
Oh, I think I know what happened. Hold on.
Yeah, I think when you were muting, you thought just yourself, but it also muted the share. So it's just a few seconds.
Okay, so that was pauperism. Apart from vagabonds, criminals, prostitutes, in short, the actual lumpen proletariat, this social stratum consists of three categories. And before we do the three categories, this is really worth noting and lingering on. The phrase the lumpen proletariat is going to be at least somewhat familiar to any of you who have looked into Marx's more journalistic and, immediately political writings, the class struggles in France, the 18th Brumaire, all that stuff. It also comes up a fair amount in certain kinds of much later, post-Marx Marxist debates, for example, about, roots of fascism, and it has all kinds of weird afterlives, like certain examples of 1970s new left revolutionaries saying, hey, the industrial working class has been co-opted, it's bought into the system, right? You read like Marcuse, something like that. The real revolutionary subject now is the lumpen proletariat in the ghettos. But there's also a lot of confusion about exactly what this term refers to. And some Marxists will use it in a way that suggests that any old unemployed person is a lumpen proletariat, right? That if you're laid off by the boss, the next day you're a member of the lumpen proletariat. But Marx is clearly not using the term in this kind of very broad way. First, we know he's not doing that because he just gave us two categories of unemployed people and one category of severely underemployed people who he wasn't calling lumpen. Right? The floating, the stagnant, the latent. Second, because he's about to give us a bunch of people who live on a rung of society below any of those three categories, but he's also explicitly excluded from the lumpen proletariat. And thirdly, because he just associated that term with a fairly short list of categories, the population. Remember, vagabonds, criminals, prostitutes, in short, the actual lumpen proletariat. So I was thinking about what to say about this, and it occurred to me that my friend Daniel Tutt is somebody who spent a lot more time than I have thinking about the lumpen proletariat. I know it's written about it. And so I thought it might be interesting to bring him in to talk to you guys about that, and just maybe we can vary up the usual format a little bit and do a little bit of discussion in this part of the class. But Daniel, you want to just kind of, well, first of all, thank you for doing this, and do you want to give us a general sense of kind of what the debates are there and what your intervention has been?
Absolutely. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Is everybody on the West Coast, or it's kind of all over the country?
It's all over the country, and I don't know if there are any of these people are here today, but there have in the past been one or two people in the UK and other places.
Okay, great. Wonderful. Thanks so much, Ben, for inviting me. Yeah, I don't really have a lecture or formal presentation, but I'm just really happy to be here. And I suppose I just want to say a few things because, Ben mentioned that in the 1970s with the New Left, there was a lot of opinions, which I found interesting, that really the lumpen proletariat is this sort of revolutionary class. This was evoked by, like, for example, the Black Panthers, by Aldrich Cleaver, by Huey Newton. And, this is, you have famously Aldrich Cleaver writing an essay called Lumpen Ideology, where he's warning that what is happening to the Black working class will happen to the white working class, even though I don't think we should understand the working class in such stark racialist terms, of course. But what his point is a little bit more grounded in political economy and a little bit worth teasing out. I mean, his basic point is that there is a relationship between the intensification of finance capital and its dominance over the working class and the de-skilling, the casualization of the working class, and therefore a type of what we often call in popular parlance downward mobility of the working class. And that this has particular ideological effects, right? So the Panthers, as well as Frantz Fanon, Frantz Fanon also argued that the lumpen proletariat in the colonial regions have some type of extra militant possibility, right? Now, that was not the position of all of the New Left. Let's take the example of Hal Draper. Hal Draper, is a real interesting American Marxist thinker. He was one of the main muses of the Berkeley free speech movement, and he wrote a 4-volume work, which is something I highly recommend, which is basically a political biography of Marx and Engels. And he famously argued that we should understand the lumpen proletariat as what he called a non-class. In other words, it's actually not to be understood as embedded or fluid with the processes that we're studying here that Ben just articulated with this notion of relative surplus population. So within relative surplus population, there is this third lower tier, the chronically unemployed, like the criminals. It really depends on how you want to categorize this. I mean, especially with the gig economy, and we can get to that in a moment. But Draper is basically saying that that is the lumpen proletariat. They are best understood not in a structural continuity with the working class, but as totally separate from the working class, okay? Now, again, that's very different than what the Black Panthers were arguing, and what more recent writers like Clyde Barrow in his wonderful book called The Dangerous Class, which is a whole sort of elaborate reconsideration of what the lumpen proletariat actually is. And Barrow, who's highly influenced me, I've hosted him on my podcast. I actually hosted a conference on his book because he thinks that this idea that Eldridge Cleaver had of lumpen ideology explains Trumpism. So that is a very interesting claim, and I want to explain what he means by that in a moment. But his argument is basically that within Capital, and specifically the chapter that you guys are reading right now, Marx gives us what he calls a kind of continuity theory. And so what is the continuity theory of the lumpen proletariat? Well, it basically stretches back to the origins of the proletariat as we know it historically, from displaced agricultural laborers. And as early as Engels's work on the condition of the working class in England, 1845, right? We have this idea that the modern proletariat was effectively lumpenized into a surplus population that then became the precondition for their becoming the labor reserve army of capital, okay? And that's created a lot of debate because some folks have argued that, well, you actually had a lumpen population, this kind of, which actually, by the way, stretching back in ancient Greece, it has a kind of spiritual capacity because they're sort of the outcasts. Even in India today, the untouchables are sort of revered because they sort of transcend the class system. And so as we're thinking about the topography of class in Marxism and all of its complexity, we should remember that point, which is that lumpen ideology, or the lumpen as a cultural category, okay? What does Marx refer to them as? Well, they make the proletariat into a sack of potatoes. In other words, paradoxically, the lumpen as this, well, let's say, according to Draper, a non-class, totally other than the working class. Why are they harmful? Well, they're harmful because they disrupt the possibility of the proletariat generating a collective self-interest for itself. Instead, Marx, in his political writings, which Ben mentioned, the 18th of Brumaire, Civil War in France, what is the problem with the lumpen? Problem with the lumpen is that they forge an alliance with the interests of finance capital against the working class, because their interests are not tied to productive labor itself. And that is why you get a very interesting combination of the interests of the finance aristocracy with the lumpen. And so what does that actually produce? Well, it produces some pretty pernicious things at a larger scale. Kautsky and later Second International Marxists would argue that because you have this relative surplus population of the three levels that Ben articulated, they are sort of split between, and Engels wrote about this too, and it becomes almost like a moral question, frankly. They're split between what Engels called honest lumpens and scoundrel lumpens. And Engels, you literally use the word honest lumpens, which is very interesting. And Kautsky kind of had the same idea. And what they basically argued was that the working class needs to pay them off. And so what you have introduced, to pay them off, why? Because in a political, like kinetic political situation, they can be quite disruptive to a political movement. They can, because they are desperate for a stability that has been deprived to them, their political action is highly unpredictable, basically. And that's why Kautsky had the idea that they must be paid off. Frankly, it's a question also of violence, because they are willing. I mean, Clyde Barrow makes the argument that you can associate the status of, like, if you want to just make this like ultra contemporary, ultra present, the status of members of the working class who refuse to continue basic schooling and take their chances without getting basic education, whether that be high school or even like an associate's degree. He associates them with the lumpen proletariat, and then he shows that there's a direct correlation between that social class and the state through the military draft or military conscription, or sort of like the military, what he calls like lumpen, the state produces a lumpen complex, okay? And this is actually something that's been going on stretching back to Vietnam. And Barrow makes a pretty interesting argument that you can understand elements of white nationalism that support Trump vis-a-vis a lumpen analysis of class position. And moreover, he thinks, and I think this is somewhat debatable, even that Donald Trump's Jan 6 insurrection was also kind of driven by a lumpen ideology. And so what actually is a lumpen ideology? I've kind of hinted at that. The basic notion of a lumpen ideology is a ideology which paradoxically is in favor of the status quo under conditions of finance aristocracy. So when you have advanced parasitic financial capitalism, you have emerge imperialism on the one hand, which is something that Lenin talks about in his famous manifesto on imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. But you also have the abuse by the financial elite of this lumpenized class, of this surplus population. And they are abused in a multiplicity of ways. One of the ways that they are abused, as I've just mentioned, is this possibility of them becoming a kind of paramilitary appendage to the state, or them becoming like an ultra reactionary force that ultimately seeks to undermine the working class interest. Or in some cases, according to the Panthers, they become the vanguard for how to organize inner city blight, right? So the Panthers have this notion of if the state is going to completely remove any welfare interests for the inner city, what we need to do is basically concoct a kind of vanguard lumpen to imitate the forces of the welfare state, right? I'm not too convinced of that politics. I frankly, we can discuss this. I don't think that it's really panned out at all. I think it actually is deeply problematic, but but nonetheless, this ideological thing is real, right?
All right. So there's obviously a whole lot more to that discussion. As I said, we'll put out a much longer clip of the discussion with Daniel later this week, maybe next week. If you want to watch it now, though, if you're like, no, I care not for your post game. I want to just finish this. I do want to point out you can join that class at any time. That you get instant access to all 25 of the Zoom recordings so far, and also of course, you can join live for the approximately 1 trillion that we're going to have left, because we're almost done with chapter 25. So as I said earlier, Professor Richard Wolff, as Michael Brooks used to call him, at least probably Big Dick Wolf, is going to be guest lecturing next week, which I'm really looking forward to. I love that guy. And he's going to finish us off with chapter 25, and then we have 8 chapters left of volume 1, and then all of volume 2, all of volume 3. I expect that by the time we finish this class, it's going to be like a cheesy like TV flash forward. I'm going to have white hair and stuff because so much time has passed. So you can certainly join at any time as patreon.com/Ben Burgess, and just join at the capital class tier. And of course, then you also have access to everything else that you get at the just standard GTAA patron tier, such as the post game, which is what we are going to go to now. So if you are already one of the best people on the planet and have joined the Patreon, then you should already have, I believe, a link in your email to go to the Wolf Griscom stuff. If people don't know what Bad Lefty is talking about, just go to the Old Michael Brooks Show YouTube page, and you people know how to do search terms, so you'll find that, and it is all very fun stuff. But in any case, if you are already one of the best people on the planet and are a GTAA patron already, then you should have a link to the post game for patrons, which is what we're going to go to right now. If not, of course, there is no time like the present. And one way or the other, we will see you over there in, I don't know, 2 or 3 minutes. Left is best.